Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. When I was growing up, I would often go down the basement where my dad had set up bookshelves that he'd made into a library. I would scan the shelves, searching for something interesting to read. Over the years, I read many of those books, some of them several times. Two books I remember that were always shelved right next to each other came from my dad's childhood collection. One of them was about hockey, and the second was The Winning Basket by Duane Yarnell. I think I only read the hockey book once, but the story of Ben Mason in The Winning Basket was so exciting and engaging that I read it again and again. I hope you'll enjoy it as well. Ben Mason is an orphan who, after his parents died in a flood, ran away from an orphanage and was taken in by a kindly older couple who gave him a home filled with love and support. Now Ben is 17, and he has applied to and been accepted at the prestigious Clearview Military Academy. On his train ride to Clearview, he happens to meet Rod King, the captain of the school's basketball team, who invites Ben to try out for a spot on the team. After a rather lonely childhood, maybe Ben has found a place to fit in and find some real friends. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Winning Basket by Duane Yarnell. Chapter 1. A Dream Come True. Ben Mason had never been happier. He read the letter again. He pinched himself. He turned, eyes glowing, to the stout elderly lady who sat across the dining room table. "Oh, Granny," Ben said, "I'm afraid I'll wake up. All my life I've wanted this to happen to me, and now that it has, I can't believe it." Granny White smiled fondly at Ben. "Well, I'll declare, Ben," she said, "you've gone on so much that you've forgotten to tell me what this is all about. All I know is that a letter came for you this morning, and since then you've been shouting and laughing. You might tell Granny about it." A slow smile crossed Ben's earnest young face. He moved around the table, held the letter in front of Granny. As she read it, Ben couldn't resist the temptation to reread it himself. Clearview Military Academy. Ben Mason. Central City. December 17th. Dear Sir, we are pleased to inform you that your application for enrollment at Clearview Military Academy has been accepted by the board. The winter term begins January 4th. However, the dormitories will be open after Christmas. If it is convenient, could you appear at the office of the president of Clearview sometime before the first of the year? It is advisable for new students to enroll early, so that by the time the classes get underway, the new student will be familiar with Clearview's rules and traditions. We look forward to seeing you soon. Office of the Registrar. When Granny White looked up, her eyes were misty. She smiled and began to polish her glasses furiously. "I'm glad, Ben. I'm happy for you. I can't wait to tell Gramps the good news." "What good news, Mother?" a voice said from the doorway. Gramps White came striding into the room. His eyes, brown as an autumn meadow, were twinkling. He clapped Ben on the shoulder. "You might say something, Ben. What's happened?" "The letter!" Ben exclaimed. "The letter from the military academy came this morning. They've accepted me. Do you realize what that means?" "Well, the first thing it means is that I lose a grade A mechanic. The old garage won't seem the same without you to help out, Ben." For an instant, Ben Mason's spirit sank. "Gee, Gramps," Ben said slowly, "I feel that I shouldn't leave you. After all these years, you've been like a father to me. You've paid me to work at the garage and—" "Now you be quiet," Gramps interrupted. "I know what you're thinking. You think I can't get along at the garage without you. Well, I can't. So I'm going to sell. Granny and I are old enough to retire. We've saved enough money. With you gone, there won't be any reason to work. And I don't want you to feel guilty because I've paid you a small salary. You're a better mechanic than the average man, Ben. I've saved a lot of money by having you work for me." Granny interrupted the conversation. "He means it, Ben. But what I want to know is if you really have enough money." Ben Mason wasn't positive, but he had always made his own way, and he hated to share his worries with anyone else. So he said, Yes, I have enough. I sent my tuition with my enrollment blank. The tuition covers living expenses too." Ben failed to add that he didn't have another cent, that he hoped to get some sort of part-time employment to take care of his personal expenses. As for next year, he intended to work hard so that he could win a scholarship that would make it possible for him to continue his education. Ben went upstairs to the room he had lived in for so many years. Everything there was dear to him. Books, medals, pennants, reminders of his happy years at Central City High. A lump came up in Ben's throat. Although he was going away to a place he had dreamed of, it was going to be difficult leaving Central City and his many friends, especially Granny and Gramps. Before Ben realized it, Granny was in the room with him. "You're quiet, Ben," she said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I was just thinking." Suddenly, Ben turned, faced the white-haired old lady who had cared for him so long. "Granny, I don't know how to say it, but, well, I owe you so much. Not many people would take in a homeless orphan and—" "Ben Mason, you hush this minute." Granny's words were sharp, but there was a soft, motherly look in her eyes. She came over to him, touched his arm. "I've never thought of you as an orphan, Ben. To me, you've been as dear as my own flesh and blood." That helped to lessen the load that was suddenly around Ben Mason's square young shoulders. But he was still wondering about something. He sat on his favorite leather chair. His blue eyes were quizzical. "Granny, don't you remember anything about me? Can't you give me some kind of an idea as to who my parents really were?" The old lady looked at Ben quickly, sympathetically, then looked away. "I'm sorry, Ben," she said gently. "You were only a youngster when we found you in the barn that morning. I wanted to tell the authorities, but you cried so that I didn't have the courage. You were wearing clothes from some orphanage, but the name stamped on them was so dim that I couldn't tell exactly what it was. You begged me not to let the bad people come get you." Far back, Ben could remember a nice white house with a tall fence around it. He faintly remembered a mother and father who had been good to him. Then one night there had been a terrible flood. Ben remembered the house being washed away, the awful sight of his mother and father being swept out into the swirling water. After that, much of it was a blank. Ben, who was 5 at the time, could not recall all the things that had happened. But there was one thing that was clear. One day, Ben had been taken to another building. He had a small cloth filled with playthings and clothes that had been saved from the flood. There were a lot of other children there, and none of them seemed happy. One of the children had told Ben that he was an orphan, and Ben, bewildered and alone, had felt like crying, but he didn't. Ben didn't even cry when he was scolded that night for asking for his mother. He only knew that his new home wasn't a happy place. Ben was young, and it wasn't clear to him that his mother and father would never be back. So that night in the darkness, he decided he must go hunt for them. So Ben slipped out of bed and down the stairs. He climbed through a window. Across the alley, he saw a lot of trucks gathered around a store. They were being filled with large boxes. Ben climbed into one of the trucks and hid behind the boxes. The truck began to move, and Ben went to sleep. When he awakened, it was daylight, and the truck was stopped. He heard a lot of men talking, and he hid down close to the floor. When they stopped talking, Ben climbed out of the truck. He was standing in an alley behind a group of stores. Ben walked down the alley until he was tired. He reached the outskirts of the small town and knew that he was very sleepy. Behind a white bungalow was a nice, clean-looking barn. Ben went inside. It was like the barn his mother and father had owned. So Ben climbed up in the hayloft and went to sleep in the hay. Now, more than 10 years later, Ben Mason remembered all of that. He remembered how Granny White had found him, curled up asleep. He remembered how he had cried when Granny had told him that he must be taken back to wherever he had come from. Now in his own room, where he had lived so long, Ben looked across at Granny. "I'm glad you didn't send me back," he said quietly. "I'm glad you let me be your boy, even though you might have gotten into trouble." "Sakes alive, honey," Granny said. "I could tell that you were afraid of something. You told us your name, but that was about all we could get out of you. What I did wasn't wrong. I'd do it again, Ben." "I just want you to know one thing, Granny. I'll always wonder who my mother and father really were, but I'll always remember that you and Gramps took their places." The days sped by rapidly, and before Ben realized it, the time had come for him to leave. He had managed to get enough money to take him to Clearview Academy, but after he had bought his ticket on the train, he was again without funds. After riding all day without food, Ben began to grow uncomfortable. A white-jacketed man walked through the train. He was pounding a brass gong and shouting, "Last call for dinner! Dinner in the dining car ahead!" Ben's mouth began to water. He wished he had had Granny pack a lunch, but he hadn't wanted to impose on her any more. Now, however, he kept remembering how well he liked Granny's home-baked pies. Finally, Ben got up. He walked toward the end of the coach to get a drink of water. Most of the seats were deserted, as many people were eating in the dining car ahead. Ben got his drink. Then he started back to his seat, watching the swaying floor as the train rounded a sharp curve. He walked past seat after seat, and then he saw something that startled him. Lying upon the floor, in plain view beneath a seat, was a leather billfold. Ben picked it up. The billfold seemed thick, and he looked inside it. There were many green bills. It looked like a fortune to him. Looking around, he saw that no one was watching. Across the aisle was a young man, but he was asleep. It occurred to Ben that here was an answer to his problem. With all that money, it would have been possible for him to go to school without having to do extra work. It was a pleasant feeling, but Ben Mason didn't have it long. There was only one thing to do, and Ben did it. He sat in the chair until a man came in. The man was heavy, middle-aged, and expensively dressed. He lifted his eyebrows when he saw Ben. "I beg your pardon," he said, "but aren't you in my seat?" "Yes, sir," Ben said. "I wonder if you've lost anything." The man smiled pleasantly. He began to go through his pockets. No, I don't think so, young fellow. Why, my billfold's gone. I paid for my meal out of the loose change in my pocket. Ben handed the man the lost billfold. The man sat down. "This is rather important, young man. I'm getting off at the next town. This money is to be given to a charitable institution. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Sit down, won't you?" Ben was glad to sit down, glad to have someone to talk to. The man continued, "You have fine stuff in you, young fellow. You could have gotten away with that money, and I'd never have discovered it until too late to trace it. What's your name, young man?" Ben Mason. I'm enrolling at Clearview Military Academy next term." "Well, that's quite a place. But you're what I'd expect to be enrolling there." The man's eyes began to twinkle. "Tell me, soldier, do you suppose you could spend a $10 bill if I gave it to you? After all, you have some sort of reward coming." "Thanks," Ben said, "but you don't owe me anything. I don't expect a reward. Not when the money is for charity, anyway." "But I could at least buy your meal. Here, take a couple of dollars and go up to the dining car. You still have time to eat." Ben accepted, and a while later was sitting down before a tempting plate of roast beef. He was just preparing to eat when a young man sat down across the table from him. The young man was 17, Ben's age. His hair was light, and his eyes were as blue as a summer sky. The young man held out his hand. "I'm Rodney," he said. "Rod King. I'm a second-year man at Clearview Academy. I overheard what you said about enrolling there. When we get there, you'll be a plebe, and I'll be an upperclassman. And I probably won't acknowledge you. But before we get there, we're just a couple of friends." Ben was overcome with emotion. He took the other's hand and stammered embarrassedly for a moment. I'm glad to know you, King," he said. "It's nice of you to introduce yourself. But I'll probably drive you insane before morning. There are so many questions I want to ask about Clearview. I've only seen pictures of the place." Rod King sat down and ordered a meal. When he looked back at Ben, his blue eyes were serious. "I saw what you did back there, Mason. Most fellows would have kept the money, or at least hesitated a bit. The fact that you didn't makes you a right sort of fellow, and I'm serious when I say that I'm glad you're going to Clearview. I only hope we get to know each other better. Say, ever play basketball?" Ben smiled as he shook his head. "I played football, but not basketball. I'm afraid I wouldn't be much good at the game." "But why not? You're tall and strong-looking. And if you played football, you know something about team play. The reason I ask is because I'm captain of the basketball team at Clearview. Our season starts right after the winter term begins. To date, we haven't too much in the way of material. If we don't beat Navy Prep this season, I'll feel that I wasn't a very good captain. How about your coming out tomorrow afternoon after you enroll? I'm not overlooking a single chance." Ben Mason felt strangely flattered and content. Leaving Central City had been difficult, but already he was forgetting that he had ever felt discouraged. Already it seemed that he had been a Clearview man forever. Chapter 2. A Plebe at Last. In the early hours of the gray dawn, the train pulled into the station. Ben Mason was the first to leave the train. He placed his grips on the end of the platform and then turned his face toward the hill. At that moment, the sun came over the horizon, and every building upon the hill was visible against the sunlight. As Ben looked, a choking lump came up in his throat. The gray buildings of Clearview Academy, the proud limestone administration building, the long red-roofed dormitories, the flag flapping proudly in the breeze before the administration building. It was a stirring sight, one that caused Ben Mason to stand there silently, happily. "Like it, Ben?" Ben turned, faced Rod King, his acquaintance of the evening before. "Like it?" Ben exclaimed huskily. "Who wouldn't?" There were shouts from up the platform. Rod placed his arm upon Ben's shoulder. "Well, Ben, from now on you're on your own. It's all part of the tradition of the place. There'll be tough assignments from the upperclassmen, but all first-year men can expect that. Just grit your teeth and smile, and you'll be accepted as one of us. Well, here's the pack. I'll help you all I can." A group of laughing students descended upon Ben and Rod. They were wearing smart-looking military uniforms. For a moment they laughed and joked with Rod. Then one of them turned to Ben. "Say, who's this new man, a plebe?" "I'm a plebe," Ben said. "I'm just getting ready to enroll for the winter term. "Quiet, plebe," a husky young man commanded. "A plebe is to be seen and not heard." For an instant, Ben felt ill at ease. Then he smiled and saluted sharply. He understood. This was all a part of the game, and he loved it. The husky young man said, "Carry your bags up the hill, plebe, then run around the track 3 times. After that, report to room 27, and I'll give you something to do." "But I'm supposed to enroll." Ben stopped then. "I'm sorry, sir. Very well, sir." Ben saluted smartly, then began the long climb up the hill. He wanted to linger, wanted to see everything there was to see. But he remembered his orders. To his left, behind the field houses, was the track, barely covered with a fine white screen of snow. Ben left his bags beside the flagpole and walked toward the athletic field. For a moment, he paused beside the field house while he read a large inscription. "Salute, ye men of Clearview who passed this way. Salute the brave men who have gone this way before. Salute the great tradition of Clearview, and pray that you become a part of it." Ben stood there at attention as he read the inscription. For a moment he closed his eyes. In his mind, he could imagine the hundreds and thousands of eager-eyed young men who had done exactly this same thing before him. Men who had come to Clearview Academy to get their start in life. It was nice, knowing that he was a part of a thing so fine. Hurriedly then, Ben went out to the track. He was stiff after the ride in the chair car, and running around the track was a nice way of limbering up. Slowly at first, and then faster, Ben ran. Running was easy for Ben. He had lived cleanly and had exercised freely. His muscles were trained to respond to the will of his mind. Almost before Ben realized it, the run was finished. He hurried back, got his bags, and then started toward his destination. But it suddenly occurred to Ben that he wasn't familiar with the campus. He saw a gray-clad young cadet walking across the lawn. "Say there," Ben said, "could you tell me where I can find room 27? The man wheeled. He was a little taller than Ben, a little thinner. His eyes were dark and close together. There was a look of hostility in them that smoldered. "When you address an upperclassman, plebe, don't forget to say sir. As punishment, come to room 39 when you're finished. I'll have some work for you to do." Ben Mason sensed that there was no friendliness in this cadet's attitude. It annoyed Ben as well as puzzled him. But he knew that it wouldn't pay to discuss his feelings, so he repeated his question. "Could you tell me, please, sir, where I can find room 27? The cadet smiled in satisfaction, but it was a grim sort of smile that further puzzled Ben. He pointed toward the first of a series of dormitories. 27's in there. Don't forget what I told you to do when you finish. Salute me, plebe." Ben saluted. He tried to feel that this was a part of the tradition of Clearview Academy, but somehow that didn't ring true. He did a swift turn, then hurried toward the dormitory that housed the mysterious room 27. Ben soon found the room. It was on the second floor of the clean, gray-walled dormitory. Ben knocked. The door opened and he stepped inside. A group of cadets were lounging in there. The heavy-set one, who had given Ben the orders, stood up and faced him. "You made quick time, plebe. For that, your duties won't be so heavy. All we want you to do is shine the shoes you'll find under the bed there. You'll be excused after that." Ben fell to work immediately. There were 4 pairs of shoes, and the shoe shine was there beside them. As Ben worked, he heard the upperclassmen discussing the coming basketball season. That reminded him of his promise to report to the gymnasium this afternoon, after he enrolled. Ben was finished within half an hour. He exhibited the shoes. The heavy-set one, whom the rest of the cadets had called Hal Chase, said, "That's a nice job, plebe. You're excused now." Ben noticed that Hal Chase's voice was friendlier. He believed he had acquitted himself well. There was one thought that was further encouraging. Next year, Ben would be a second-year man. Next year he would be friends with these men, would be one of them. Ben's pleasant thoughts were interrupted when the door slammed open. He was surprised to see the cadet who had ordered him to room 39. The cadet's eyes were still hostile. "What's the matter, plebe? What are you waiting for? I told you I wanted you in my room." Ben tried not to resent the cadet's bitter tone. As quietly as he could, he said, "I just finished here, sir. I'll go to your room at once." "Unpack my books, plebe. Then shine my shoes. You'll find 6 pairs in the closet. After that you can press my pants. Be sure to get the mud off the cuffs and don't scorch them. If I can think of anything else, I'll be down there." Ben left, and as he closed the door, he heard Hal Chase's sudden explosion. "What have you against this plebe, Lassiter? Don't be so hard on him. This is his first day." "Plebes are supposed to work. It's good for 'em. When Jack Lassiter tells 'em to jump, they'd better jump, too." "If you weren't a big man on the basketball team, Lassiter, you couldn't get away with some of the things you do." Ben didn't wait to hear more. His morning was already too crowded to stand around listening to other cadets talk. For the rest of that morning, and a part of the afternoon, Ben worked in Jack Lassiter's room. Then, when he was finished, he hurried over to the administration building. There were several new men in the line before the president's office. Ben waited his turn. Then, after a while, he was led inside, where he was greeted by a kindly-faced, distinguished-looking old gentleman. "I'm President Smathers. According to your card, you're Ben Mason. How do you like it, Ben?" Ben forgot the toilsome hours he had spent working for Jack Lassiter. He forgot that he hadn't eaten since the night before. He said honestly, "I like it fine, sir." The president smiled. "Here's a schedule card. Decide which subjects you want to take and hand it in by tomorrow evening. You'll find your dormitory and room number listed on the schedule card. Best of luck to you, Mason." Ben hurried out, thankful that his interview had ended so quickly. It was after 3, and without bothering to go by to see his room, Ben walked over to the gymnasium. Inside, he found a dozen or more cadets bouncing a basketball and shooting at the baskets. It was obvious that they were just limbering up and were not practicing very seriously. Rod King, the basketball captain, saw Ben. "There you are," he said. "You needn't get dressed for today. You'll find an old pair of gym shoes over against the sideline. Put them on and come back. We'll see what you have. And you needn't bother about formality. On the basketball floor, a man is as good as his ability. You needn't bother about saluting and saying, 'Sir.'" Ben climbed into the gym shoes and in a moment was back on the floor, ready for whatever might happen. It didn't make him feel any better to observe that Jack Lassiter was a member of the practicing aggregation. Lassiter, seeing Ben, said, "You could have done a better job on my shoes, plebe." "Take it easy, Lassiter," Rod warned. "I invited Mason down here for a workout. If you have anything to settle with him, do it outside. Right now I want to know whether he can play basketball or not." Rod turned to Ben. "Do you know anything about the game at all, Mason?" Ben smiled. "Well, I know that there are 5 men on each team, and that the idea is to toss the ball through the basket. Every score counts 2 points. Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm a greenhorn." Rod took Ben down to the other end of the court. He handed him a ball. "The most important thing," Rod said, is to learn how to handle the ball. Here, you take it and stay down here a while." At first, Ben had his doubts about the whole business, but when he began to bounce the leather ball upon the floor, he was surprised how simple it was for him. Gradually, Ben became skilled enough so that he could run and bounce the ball at the same time. He didn't know it at the time, but most of his skill came from handling a football when he played end on the Central City High School Championship 11. However, when it came to shooting at the basket, Ben found more difficulty. It was easy enough to push the ball up against the gleaming white backboard that supported the basket, but making the ball roll through the hoop was another matter. Ben tried and tried, but he was none too successful. For an instant his spirit flagged, but only for an instant. This was like a tough problem back in Gramps' garage, and Ben had never backed away from problems. So he attacked this one with renewed vigor. He walked away from the basket. Then slowly he began to dribble the ball back toward it. He waited until he was almost under the rim, then tried to push the ball up over the rim. But the ball fell away, hopelessly out of control. "No, Ben, no, no." Ben looked around at Rod King. He felt awkward, but somehow he didn't feel embarrassed with Rod. "I'm all thumbs," Ben exclaimed. "I can't seem to get it." Rod smiled. "I've been watching you, mister. You handle that ball like a veteran. I can tell you've played lots of football. Your trouble right now is that you lack a few shooting rules. Fundamentals, we call them. The same as in football. In the first place, when you jump up for the basket, balance the ball on your right hand. All you have to do is push it gently at an imaginary spot above the hoop. That way, the ball won't bounce off the backboard as it's been doing. Here, watch me." Ben watched as Rod raced in, banked the ball in for a basket. It looked easy now that Ben knew how. So he took the ball and tried it himself. In his eagerness, he missed the first time. But the second time, the ball went cleanly through, making a comforting-sounding swish in the netting. "That's the way," Rod approved. "You're a little rough, but there's nothing practice won't fix. Ben Mason, you may not realize it, but before the end of the season, you're going to be wearing a Clearview basketball emblem. If you have the grit to work hard, you'll succeed. You happen to be built just right to make a crack forward. How does that sound?" For a moment, Ben Mason couldn't answer. How did it sound? Why, it sounded so well that Ben's pulse was racing. In his mind, he saw many rosy-colored pictures. He saw himself a first-year man, being accepted as a loyal cadet. He felt tight across the chest at the thought of being able to play in the great game against Navy Prep. Ben's life had been a lonely one. Of course, he had had Granny and Gramps, and his friends in high school, but most of his time had been spent in working, and now he saw a chance to gain some of the friendships that he had missed before. It sounds swell," Ben exclaimed, "but I'm not sure I can measure up." "Don't worry," Rod answered. "You just keep your chin up and pay attention to business. We have a real coach here, and he can teach you a lot. He'll be back from his vacation in 2 or 3 days. Now, come with me." Rod blew a whistle that hung from his neck. The rest of the practice squad came up to the center of the floor. Rod said, "We're going to practice dribbling through each other. I'll start off. Who wants to defend the goal?" Jack Lassiter stepped forward. "I'll defend it," he said. At the same time, he cast a rather eager sidelong glance at Ben. Ben only half guessed what might be coming. Ben got in line behind Rod. Jack Lassiter walked down under the basket and turned around to face Rod. Just before starting, Rod said, "This is the same as football, Ben. The team that has the ball is the offense. The defenders are the defense. I'm going to try to dribble the ball past Lassiter and score a basket. Watch how I try to do it." Ben watched, and what he saw was a clever exhibition of court tactics by both players. Rod dribbled up close to Jack. He started to shoot, but instead of really shooting, he held the ball and tried to draw Jack Lassiter off balance. Lassiter went off just a little bit, but before Rod could shoot, Lassiter reached out and deflected the ball so that it went dribbling across the sideline. Ben couldn't help the feel of admiration he had for Lassiter's stellar defense work. The man really understood the game. Rod came back smiling. He tossed the ball to Ben. "You saw how not to do it," he laughed. "Now let's watch you do it the right way." Ben began to dribble slowly. He couldn't understand it, but for the first time in a long time, he was flushed with a spirit, a desire for competition. More than ever, he wanted to succeed in driving past Jack Lassiter. 5 feet in front of Lassiter, Ben stopped, but he stood there, bouncing the ball up and down. Ben's purpose was to force Lassiter to move out to get him, and Lassiter did. He came out cautiously, his hands held up in front of him to prevent any shooting on Ben's part. But Ben didn't shoot. When Lassiter was almost upon him, he faked a move toward the right. Lassiter moved that way, then at the last minute, Ben changed his course, darted to the left. He was straining, hurling every atom of bronzed young muscle he possessed into the action. He went around Lassiter, went back of him, then upward, the ball resting on the palm of his hand, just as Rod had demonstrated. Ben saw Lassiter's shadow loom over him. He sent the ball away with a light flick of his fingers. He watched it cleave the netting for a counter, and then he felt as if a cyclone had landed upon him. Lassiter came down and his knee smashed into Ben's shoulder. Ben was knocked to the floor, and Lassiter fell upon him. Ben felt a smash of pain across his face, and when he wiped his hand over his nose, it came away red. The rest of the squad came racing up. Rod King gave Jack Lassiter a long, puzzled look. "That isn't a very nice way to treat a new man," Rod said. Lassiter smiled apologetically. "No," he admitted, "it isn't. Clumsy of me, wasn't it? I slipped just as I was leaping for the ball." Ben looked at the floor. It didn't look slick to him. But when Lassiter offered him a hand, he took it. "Quite all right," he said. "Accidents can happen to anyone. They're all part of the game." Chapter 3. Clouds of Despair. Ben looked about him. He saw the faces of the cadets. Everyone had witnessed the accident. Now they were nodding with approval at Ben's show of sportsmanship. More and more, Ben was feeling that there was nothing finer than to be a Clearview man. But his feeling of joy was short-lived. When it ended, it was as if a black cloud of despair had suddenly rolled down over his life, blotting out everything that had ever happened before. The whole thing began when a man entered the gymnasium. The man was tall and wore dark spectacles. He wore the gray of the academy. The boys stopped practice and saluted. Rod said, "Hello, Major Dorsey. Glad to see you back after the holidays. I think you know everyone except Mason here. Ben Mason's a new man." The major came forward, took Ben's hand. "I'm glad to meet you, Mason. I saw your enrollment application. As a matter of fact, I'm the one who passed you on." Puzzled, Ben said, But how? Why would you pass me on? You didn't know me. Not that I don't appreciate it, though." The major smiled. "I don't know you, but I fought in the war with your father. Jim Mason and I were great friends. I heard he was in Central City. When I saw your application, I was glad to see that Jim Mason thought enough of Clearview to send his son here." Ben felt his cheeks begin to flame. He said with a show of embarrassment, "But I'm not Jim Mason's son. You see, Major, I don't belong to that family of Masons. We're no relation." It was Major Dorsey's turn to be embarrassed. Well, naturally, when I approved your application, I thought you were my friend's son." The Major cleared his throat, tapping his foot nervously. "Tell me, Ben, which family of Masons do you belong to? Are you related to Jim Mason at all, by marriage or otherwise? This is important to both of us." Ben was beginning to feel weak. Something terrible seemed about to happen. He could tell by the deadly finality in the Major's tone, yet he stood his ground. "No, I don't belong to that family at all." The bitter truth came over Ben then. I'm an orphan, Major. I don't know who my parents were. I was raised in Central City by a fine old couple. I worked in a garage to earn the money to come here." "Garage? Ha! Can you imagine that?" The Major gave Lassiter a commanding look. "Be quiet, Lassiter." Then he turned to Ben again. "But how did you happen to choose Clearview Academy? That's what puzzles me." "Well," Ben admitted, "I've always wanted to go to a military school. Clearview was the closest one, and it has a fine name. When I had enough money to pay my tuition, I sent it in with my application blank." Once again, Jack Lassiter chuckled. "Heh!" And to Ben's discomfort, a few more members of the basketball squad began to look amused. At the same time, he sensed that the feeling of friendship was rapidly disappearing. Suddenly, Ben could stand it no longer. "Why do you all look at me that way, all of you? Why is that accusing look on all of your faces? I haven't done anything. And if working in a garage—" The Major put his hand upon Ben's arm. "You don't seem to see the point, Mason. You see, Clearview Academy is a very exclusive school. It's for the relatives of, well, financially well-to-do people. It costs a lot of money to attend. Surely you didn't think your tuition money would cover everything. There are extra uniforms to be purchased, as well as so many personal items that we consider necessary." "But I was going to do outside work," Ben persisted. "I thought if I could find a few furnaces to tend, or something like that." Jack Lassiter laughed openly, and even the Major appeared to be amused, although he made a noble attempt to hide it. He said, "Come with me, Mason. We must go to the office and discuss this thing with the president." Ben Mason followed the Major, and he felt as if the world had caved in around his ears. He tried to think clearly, but it was impossible. Where, a few minutes before, he had been proud to think that he was a Clearview cadet, now he realized that his happy thoughts had been premature. In the office, the Major told Ben to wait while he discussed the situation with the president. Ben was left alone. Never had he had such a difficult half-hour as that one was. His mind was filled with 1,000 doubts. But eventually the suspense ended when the Major came out. He said, "We're sorry about the mistake, Mason, but the fact of the matter is, you were accepted by error, and since you lack the, family connections, well, we're going to have to turn down your application. It's a tough blow, but you look like the kind of young fellow who can take it." It was a tough blow, but Ben Mason managed to stand up under it. He said, "Since I'm not accepted, I'd like to have my tuition. I send a draft for $500 and I need the money." "You'll get it, Mason, but you'll have to leave your forwarding address. The secretary's on his vacation, and he's the only one who has the authority to handle the school's funds. Well, goodbye. I'm sorry." Ben stood there after the Major was gone, thinking dismally that he hadn't eaten since the evening before, except for a glass of milk Rod King had brought him for breakfast. He had $500 coming to him, but before he would be able to get it, there was a chance that Ben would be half-starved. Ben walked slowly toward the outside. There were several courses opened before him. First, he could wire home for money. Granny and Gramps would be glad to send it to him, but he decided against that. Ben realized, too, that he could probably borrow from Rod King. Rod had seemed sympathetic, even though he hadn't openly admitted his feelings. But Ben Mason had a stubborn streak of pride that caused him to decide against this move, too. That left only one thing to do. It was growing dusk, and before long, it would be dark. It wasn't far to the village, and luckily, it happened to be a manufacturing town. There was just a chance, Ben decided, that he might find some sort of part-time work that would provide him with food and lodging until he could get his money from the secretary of the academy. Outside, Ben pulled his coat up against the winter evening breeze. Ahead, many lights were beginning to twinkle against the dusk. On the north side of town, close to the ice-covered river, Ben saw a group of black smokestacks. They were billowing forth huge clouds of smoke. Ben started in that direction. He thought that there must be something warm and friendly that way. He walked down rows of cheerful-looking houses, and then emerged into a business district. The store windows, filled with groceries, only served to remind Ben that he was terribly hungry. Grimly, he kept walking. At last he emerged into the factory district. He came to a large plant. Above the office entrance was a sign, Harrigan Automobile Factory. Ben tried the office door and found it open. He walked inside. Most of the employees were just getting ready to leave. Ben walked over to a desk where one man was working on a set of books. The man looked up as Ben approached. "What's eatin' you, kid?" the man asked. I'm looking for work," Ben said. "I'm a good mechanic. I know cars from A to Z, especially the Harrigan 8. We don't hire kids," the man said. "I look young," Ben persisted, "but I've worked in a garage ever since I can remember. I'm willing to work for almost anything until you see for yourself how I can handle a car job." As the man turned back to his work, a short, powerfully built individual came out of a glass-enclosed office. The man was elderly and his temples were silvered, but there was a look about him of authority. The man said, "Kelly, have you called the employment agency yet? We're doubling production next week on the new model, and we need some good valve men." The man Ben had just talked to said, "Valve men are hard to get, Mr. Harrigan. The Detroit factories are taking a lot of them. But the employment agency said they'd send over all they could in the morning." John Harrigan, owner and founder of the Harrigan Automobile Factory, stalked back into his office. Ben hurried back to the desk of Mr. Kelly. "Listen, sir," Ben persisted. "I'm familiar with valves. Give me a chance." "Say, are you here again? I thought I told you we didn't need any help from kids." Mr. Kelly got up and walked hurriedly into an office marked private. Ben walked outside, and there was a noticeable droop to his usually square shoulders. He was growing weak from hunger, and the night was bringing a cold north wind down upon him. Ben walked aimlessly. He kept trying to figure a way out of his predicament. Suddenly he had an idea. He hurried around the block until he found the shops. Then he went inside one of the buildings. It was a regular automobile assembly plant. Ben knew whom he wanted to see. "Could you tell me," he asked a guard, "where I can find the foreman of the valve assembly division?" "You mean Gus Henderson? Sure, kid. He's right over there. He's the fellow with the white coveralls and the bald head." Ben thanked the guard, and then walked across the floor until he reached the assembly line. He tapped the man on the shoulder. "Mr. Henderson," he said swiftly, "I hear you're looking for valve men. I can grind valves or assemble them in place. I've had lots of experience, and I was wondering—" Gus Henderson's blue eyes were friendly, but he cut Ben off with, "Sorry, son, I'd like to give you a job, but we take only men with references. If you can't give local references, I'm afraid you haven't a chance." "I can get references," Ben said, "but they aren't local." "Sorry, son, I wish I could help, but I can't." Once again, Ben was almost forced to admit defeat. Where would he turn next? What could he possibly do to make a connection that would assure him bed and food? Where in a strange city could a young man go in search of security? There seemed no answer to any of these questions. As Ben was leaving, he heard the guard say to another fellow, "Watch my post for me, Jim. I have to drive Mr. Harrigan's car around front. He's ready to leave for home." "Okay, are you driving him home too?" "No, he's driving himself. Imagine it. A man who's a millionaire 100 times over, and he won't even use a chauffeur." The guard went over to a long, specially built black car. He climbed in, and when the motor purred, he drove out a lifted side door. Ben followed more out of curiosity than anything else. But when he saw the guard park the car in front of the office, then climb out and start back to his post, Ben suddenly got an idea. Quickly, he climbed into the automobile's front seat. He was waiting nervously when John Harrigan came out. Harrigan opened the door next to the curb. He started to climb in, and then he saw Ben. His expression was one of mingled bewilderment and rage. He said testily, "Aren't you taking a lot for granted, young man?" Ben said desperately, "Yes, but I have to, Mr. Harrigan. Please listen to my story. It won't take but a moment." John Harrigan went around to the other side and climbed in. He was scowling as he faced Ben. "I have no time for trifles. I'm a busy man. I have many things on my mind. Now climb out like a decent young fellow and let me go home." "I know you're busy," Ben exclaimed, "but what I have to say is important. You need valve men, and I can fill the bill." "See here, youngster, you're too young to understand motors." John Harrigan's tone was gruff. "I don't like to be unkind, but I'm asking you again to let me go." Ben was close to the breaking point. "Mr. Harrigan," he said, "I read the story of your life. When you were 15, you were building cars. I'm much older than that. What is it to keep me from having the same knowledge you had?" "Are you trying to say that you're as smart as John Harrigan, young man? Well, answer me. Speak up." Ben's gaze did not waver. "I don't like to put it that way, sir. But the fact is that what one person can learn, so can another. You've proven that you know a great deal about motors. All I'm asking is a chance to prove the same." Ben half expected to be ordered out into the snow, but instead he heard a sudden, hearty chuckle. John Harrigan clapped him upon the shoulder with a large, brawny hand. "Ha! Young fellow, I admire your nerve. 1,000 people work for me, and not one has ever had the courage to stand up and tell me that he might have the same intelligence as I. If it's the chance you're wanting, I'm going to see you get it. Where is it you want to work?" In the valve assembly," Ben said. John Harrigan took a card from his pocket, scrawled across the face of it with a fountain pen. He handed the card to Ben. "Give this to Gus Henderson. He'll put you to work. And say, fellow, are you hungry? You look a bit peaked." "Yes," Ben said honestly. "I'm hungry. "Of course. Here, take this $5 bill. It's an advance on your salary. What's your name, youngster?" "Ben? Ben Mason. I don't know how to thank you." John Harrigan smiled, and some of the roughness seemed to leave his features. "You needn't thank me, youngster. When a fellow has the courage to stand up for his convictions, he's done a good job, and can look anyone in the eye. You know, Ben, I like the way you've approached me. I'm going to keep my eye on you. If you have ability, old John Harrigan will see that you get a chance to use it. They say that I'm cold-hearted, that all I think of is money. Well—" John Harrigan suddenly cleared his throat, grew gruff again. "Here, what I'm saying is this. You have your money and your job. Good night, now." Ben climbed out. He was smiling. "You're not hard," he said. "I think you're swell." "Fiddle," John Harrigan snorted. But when he drove away, he left the curb easily, and not at all like a man who is angry. Ben ate a nourishing meal in a side street cafe. He rented a room for the night in the hotel above, and then, at 8 o'clock, he walked across to the factory again. He presented his card and was allowed to go see Gus Henderson. When Henderson saw the card, he began to grin and scratch his head. "You get things done, fellow. Which shift do you want?" "I'm ready to work right now," Ben said. And he was. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to The Winning Basket. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.